Thaddeus Crowell did not knock. He pushed through the front door of Silver Briar's main house, like a man who already owned it, his attorney trailing behind him with a leather satchel and the satisfied expression of someone holding cards they haven't shown yet. Evelyn Ashbourne was at her desk, mid-signature on a hay contract, when she heard the latch and looked up. Thaddeus pulled off his hat and set it on her side table. Her side table, the one her mother had brought from St. Louis, and dropped himself into the leather chair across from her without being invited. "I've had papers drawn," he said, before she could speak. "Your father's estate, the inheritance clause, Section 4, Paragraph 3, a household provision. You know the one." Evelyn set her pen down. "Sit down, Evelyn," he added, even though she was already seated. "We should talk about what comes next. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, right now is exactly the moment to do it, because this story is only getting started, and you do not want to walk in halfway through. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels now. Let's go back to Silver Briar, and the woman who was about to fight the hardest battle of her life. The inheritance clause was real. Evelyn had read it 3 times after the attorney left her father's funeral, standing in this same room while the lamps burned low and the house settled around her the way old houses do when grief moves in. The language was precise and merciless. Silver Briar Ranch, its lands, water rights, livestock, and improvements would pass to Evelyn Margaret Ashbourne as sole heir, provided the property remained under the management of a legally recognized family household within 18 months of Edgar Ashbourne's death. 18 months. Her father had been dead for 14. She had 4 months left, and she had spent 13 of them refusing to believe the clause was enforceable. Her own attorney, a cautious man named Pruitt, who smelled of pipe tobacco and tended to deliver bad news in the form of throat clearing, had spent the last 2 months telling her otherwise. "The clause is old language," Pruitt had said at their last meeting. "Frontier-era drafting. Your grandfather put it in when your father was young, and the territory was still sorting itself out. A woman managing a ranch of this size alone, it wasn't something the original document contemplated. My grandfather drafted it to protect the ranch from being broken up," Evelyn had said. "Your grandfather drafted it to ensure a man was in charge of it." She had not answered that, because they both knew it was true. Thaddeus knew it too. That was what the expression on his face said now, as he sat in her leather chair without permission, his attorney standing slightly behind him like a shadow that charged by the hour. "The clause requires a recognized household," Thaddeus said. "You are a single woman managing a cattle operation. The court will have questions." "I have managed this ranch for 11 years, Evelyn said. "My father was ill for most of the last 7. Silver Briar runs because I run it. I know that." "Then you know your claim is built on a technicality." Thaddeus smiled. He was 61 years old, her father's younger brother, a man who had spent his life resenting Edgar Ashbourne for inheriting the better piece of the family's ambition. He was not cruel in any violent way. He was simply determined, and determination in a man with lawyers and patience could accomplish things that cruelty never could. "A technicality," he said, "upheld by the original deed and recognized under territorial law. Evelyn, I am not your enemy. I am offering you a reasonable path. Sign the ranch into a joint management arrangement. My firm oversees the water rights and grazing contracts. You retain a generous residential interest, and we avoid the ugliness of a court proceeding. And if I refuse?" He picked up his hat from her side table and stood. "Then I file the petition at the end of the month, and the court decides what a recognized household means." He nodded to his attorney, who snapped the leather satchel shut. "Think carefully. You have built something impressive here. It would be a shame to watch strangers divide it." He walked out of her house without closing the door behind him. Evelyn sat at her desk for a long time after the sound of their horses faded. Then she picked up her pen and finished signing the hay contract, because the cattle still needed feeding, regardless of what Thaddeus intended, and because her hands needed something to do before she let herself feel how frightened she was. She was not a woman who frightened easily. That was something the valley knew about her and mostly respected, though some of the older men in town still found it faintly unsettling. A woman who could read a contract, fire an incompetent foreman, and negotiate a water rights dispute without once deferring to a man's opinion in the room. At 36, Evelyn had outlasted 2 droughts, 1 catastrophic winter, a cattle fever outbreak, and the slow, terrible process of watching her father disappear piece by piece over 7 years. She had done all of it alone. She had believed that was enough. She walked outside after dark and stood at the fence line, where the home pasture met the long slope down toward the creek. The mountains to the north were still capped with late-season snow, pale against the sky. Silver briars stretched in every direction around her, the south grazing sections, the upper meadows, the breeding corrals, the hayfields still stubbled from last harvest. 6,000 acres, water rights that 3 neighboring ranches depended on. A horse herd that men came from 2 counties over to look at. Her father had built it. She had kept it alive. And now she needed a husband. The thought sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong. She had no shortage of candidates. Half the wealthy ranchers in the valley had made their interest known in one form or another since Edgar's death. Gideon Voss, most persistently, who owned the largest cattle operation south of the river, and who had stopped by Silver Briar so many times in the past year that her foreman, a blunt-spoken man named Cutter, had started taking bets among the hands about when he'd finally propose. Voss was 44, well-dressed, respected, reasonably intelligent, and the last man on earth Evelyn intended to marry. She had watched Gideon Voss manage people for long enough to understand what he was. He was the kind of man who expressed opinions like they were facts and interpreted disagreement as confusion that needed correcting. He would not steal Silver Briar from her. He would simply manage it until it was no longer recognizable as something she had built. And he would do it with great confidence and no particular malice, which was almost worse. She thought about the problem the same way she thought about difficult horses, not from the front, where everything was teeth and resistance, but from the side, where the actual shape of the thing was visible. She did not need a partner. She did not need someone who wanted Silver Briar. She needed someone who wanted nothing from her at all, and that was a different kind of man, entirely. It was Cutter who mentioned Bram Harlan, and he mentioned him the way you mention something half as a joke to see if it lands. There's a hand been working Kellerman's east section since March, Cutter said one morning while they were checking the north fence. Harlan. Bram Harlan. Good with horses. Quiet, shows up when he says and does what he's told without needing supervision. Kellerman's sorry to lose him. Lose him? Seasonal work runs out end of the month. He'll move on. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She was looking at a fence post that had shifted in the last rain, pressing her boot against the base to test whether it needed replacement or just repacking. He have family? She asked. Cutter was quiet a moment longer than the question required. Daughter. 8 years old. He's been bringing her along from job to job for 3 years, near as I can tell. Where's the mother? Dead. Evelyn looked at the fence post. What do you know about him? Not much. Keeps to himself. Doesn't drink past reasonable. Doesn't gamble what he can't spare. The Kellerman hands like him, which means something those boys don't like anybody who doesn't earn it. Cutter paused. He's got no land. Nothing to speak of property-wise. I know. Cutter didn't say anything else. That was one of the things she valued about him. He knew the difference between information and opinions, and he understood which one she had asked for. She rode to Kellerman's the next afternoon alone. Bram Harlan was at the far end of the east section repairing a water trough when she found him. His shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the chill, a piece of iron pipe clamped under one arm while he worked a fitting loose with both hands. He was taller than she expected, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of deliberate stillness in his movements that came from years of working around animals that spooked at sudden motion. His face was weathered in the particular way of men who spent most of their time outdoors, not rough. Exactly, but marked, like wood that had taken a lot of weather and become more interesting for it. He looked up when he heard her horse. Miss Ashbourne, he said. He knew who she was. Everyone in the valley knew who she was. Mr. Harlan. She swung down without waiting to be helped, which he did not attempt to do anyway, and tied her horse to the fence rail. I'd like to speak with you about something. He set the pipe fitting down and straightened. All right. She said it directly, which was the only way she knew to say anything that mattered. She told him about the inheritance clause, about Thaddeus and his attorney, and the petition that would be filed in less than 4 weeks if she couldn't establish a recognized household. She told him what she was proposing: a legal marriage, a household arrangement, his presence at Silver Briar for however long it took to defeat Thaddeus's claim, and wages comparable to what a senior ranch hand would earn. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was silence long enough that she heard a hawk calling somewhere above the creek. Why me? He asked. It was a fair question, and she answered it honestly. Because you have nothing that Silver Briar can give you that you'd want to take from me. The men who want to marry me want the ranch. You don't want the ranch. He was quiet again. You're right that I don't, he said. But I want to be clear about something before we go any further. Go ahead. He looked at her with an evenness she wasn't expecting, not aggressive, not deferential, just level, like a man who had made a habit of saying difficult things without dressing them up. My daughter comes with me. She's not a charity case living off your generosity while I earn my keep. She enters Silver Briar as family. She has a room, a place at the table, and she's treated accordingly by every person on that ranch. He paused. If those are your terms too, then I'll hear the rest of what you're proposing. Evelyn held his gaze. She had expected him to ask about wages, or land, or what would happen after the legal claim was settled. She had not expected the first thing out of his mouth to be about his daughter. Those are my terms, she said. He nodded once and picked up the pipe fitting. Then give me until sundown to think on it. She rode back to Silver Briar and tried not to wonder too hard about what thinking it over might produce. He came to her door that evening just before the light failed, hat in hand, his daughter standing slightly behind him. Juniper Harlan was small for 8, with her father's straight dark hair and an expression of patient wariness that belonged on someone considerably older. She was wearing a coat that had been mended at both elbows and carrying a cloth bag that appeared to contain most of her belongings. We accept your terms, Bram said. Evelyn looked at Juniper. The girl looked back at her, measuring. Hello, Juniper, Evelyn said. Hello, ma'am, the girl said. You can call me Evelyn. Juniper glanced up at her father, who gave nothing away. Then she looked back at Evelyn. All right. They were married 4 days later in the county clerk's office, with Cutter and one of Evelyn's household staff as witnesses. No reception, no announcement, no particular ceremony beyond what the law required. The clerk's secretary, a woman named Mrs. Gale, who was constitutionally incapable of keeping anything to herself, told 3 people before Evelyn and Bram had ridden back to the main road, and the valley knew by morning. The reaction was exactly what Evelyn had expected, and still managed to be worse than she had prepared for. By the end of the first week, she had received 2 notes from neighboring ranch wives expressing concern, which was the polite form of disapproval, and 1 visit from Gideon Voss himself, who arrived at her front porch wearing the particular expression of a man who considered himself owed an explanation. I heard about the marriage, he said, from his horse without dismounting. Most people have, Evelyn said. She was on the porch with a cup of coffee and did not put it down. Bram Harlan. That's correct. Gideon looked away toward the north pasture, where Bram and Cutter were visible working the fence line, then back at her. You could have come to me, Evelyn. Whatever arrangement you needed, I would have been flexible. I know you would have, she said. There was something in her tone that closed the door without slamming it, and Gideon was smart enough to hear it. He touched his hat brim and left without another word, which she respected him for, even if she knew the respect wouldn't last long, once his pride finished processing what had happened. Bram was aware of the talk. He gave no indication that it bothered him, which itself bothered some people. They expected a poor cowboy in a rich woman's house to carry the weight of the arrangement more visibly. He didn't. He showed up at dawn, worked through the day without looking for praise, and was gone to his room before the supper dishes were fully cleared. He took the small room down the hall from Juniper, not the master wing that Evelyn had offered. When she pointed this out, he said, without particular argument, I don't need that much space. And that was the end of it. He called her Evelyn. Never Mrs. Harlan, which would have been technically correct, and which every instinct she had told her he was deliberately avoiding. Not because he was trying to create distance, she gradually understood, but because he didn't want to claim something that wasn't his. Juniper settled into Silver Briar with the focused quietness of a child who had learned not to expect much from any particular place, and was therefore watching very carefully to see what this one would do. She explored the house systematically, 1 room at a time, over the first few days, touching nothing until she understood what it was. She ate every meal with the careful table manners of a child who had been taught them deliberately by a man who understood that manners were a form of dignity you could carry with you, even when you had nothing else. She asked questions that were small and practical. Where was the well? What time did the kitchen start in the morning? Were the dogs allowed indoors? Did she need to knock before entering the parlor? She did not ask questions that were personal or complicated, or about how long they were staying. Evelyn noticed this and understood it in a way she hadn't expected to. The girl wasn't incurious. She was just careful. The crisis came in the middle of the second week, and it came through a horse. Black Banner had been her father's last purchase. A coal-black stallion with a chest like a barrel and a temper that had put two experienced riders in the dirt within the first month he arrived at Silver Briar. Edgar had bought him for his bloodlines, which were exceptional, and had died before he ever successfully worked with him. In the 18 months since, no one had managed the stallion either. He had bitten one hand badly enough to send him to the doctor, shattered a gate post that would have fractured a human shin at the same angle, and demonstrated a capacity for violence that was precise and unhurried, not the panic of a frightened horse, but something more considered. Cutter wanted him gone. "He's dangerous," the foreman said, in Evelyn's office, with the finality of a man who had been making this argument for 6 months. "We've had 3 close calls. The next one might not be close. He has the best bloodlines we've ever brought onto this ranch, and no one who can handle him. Put him down or sell him to someone with a death wish, but he needs to go." She was still arguing losing, gradually, which she hated when Bram appeared in the doorway. He hadn't knocked. He looked at Cutter, then at her. "I heard some of that. The black stallion in the North Corral." "Black Banner," she said. "What's his history before he came here?" Cutter started to answer, but Evelyn held up a hand because she recognized something in the question. It wasn't curiosity, it was diagnosis. She told him what she knew. Previous owner in Wyoming, sold under circumstances that weren't fully explained. 2 ranches in the territory had passed him along. Young, relatively, only 6. Bram was quiet for a moment. "Can I see him?" "He's dangerous," Cutter said. "I understand that." He wasn't dismissive. He just wasn't deterred. Evelyn looked at Bram for a moment, this quiet man in her doorway who had been on her ranch for 11 days and had not once told her how to run it. "Go ahead," she said. She followed him to the corral. Black Banner moved to the far end when he saw them approach and stood there with his head up and his ears forward, reading them the way horses do weight distribution, direction of gaze, speed of approach. He was magnificent, and he was furious, and he was, Evelyn had come to believe, genuinely dangerous in a way that most horses were not. Bram stopped at the fence and did nothing. He did not lean over the rail. He did not make sounds. He did not extend his hand. He stood beside the fence at a slight angle, not facing the horse directly, and simply existed in the same general location until the stallion's ears shifted from forward-pinned to something less certain. "He's not mean," Bram said quietly, not moving. "He's put 2 men on the ground," Evelyn said. "Those men came at him like he owed them something." He paused. "He's scared. He's been scared long enough that he's gotten good at being the one that strikes first." She looked at the stallion and tried to see what Bram was seeing. The horse was looking at Bram now, specifically not at Evelyn, not at the fence, but at the man who was standing there doing nothing. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Today, nothing. Tomorrow, same." He finally turned from the fence. "You can't make a horse trust you. You have to give him enough time to decide to." Cutter, who had followed them and was standing a few feet back, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Bram looked at him. "I'm not asking you to agree with me, but give me 2 weeks before you decide on him." Cutter looked at Evelyn. She looked at Bram. 2 weeks was nothing, measured against a horse that might have years of usefulness if someone could reach him. 2 weeks, she said. Juniper appeared at the corral fence the next morning before breakfast, her coat buttoned wrong, watching her father stand near Black Banner with the patient stillness of someone who had seen this before. She looked at Evelyn, who had come out with coffee and stood near the fence because she found she couldn't stop watching. "He does this," Juniper said quietly. "He stood by a horse for 4 days once before it let him close. I counted." Evelyn looked at the girl. "Does it always work?" Juniper thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. "Not always," she said, "but he doesn't quit on them before he knows for sure." Evelyn looked at Bram, standing in the morning cold by the fence, while the stallion watched him from across the corral and felt something shift slightly inside her chest, not toward him. Exactly. But toward the understanding that she had possibly married a more complicated man than she had believed when she was simply looking for a name on a document. She didn't examine the feeling. She drank her coffee and went back inside to deal with the hay supplier, who had shorted last month's delivery and thought he could get away with it. But she noticed, from the window of her office that afternoon, that Juniper had gone back to the corral fence on her own. and that the stallion had taken 3 steps in the girl's direction. 3 steps was not trust. It was not safety, and it was not resolution, and Evelyn knew better than to read too much into a horse's shifting attention. But it was something, and in a life that had recently reduced itself to fighting on every front, legal, financial, social, all of it at once, she was finding that something was not nothing. The letter from Thaddeus's attorney arrived on a Thursday, carried by a rider who did not wait for a response. Evelyn read it at her desk with Bram in the chair across from her, because she had started, without deciding to, briefing him on the legal situation in the evenings, and he had started, without being asked, raising questions that were occasionally sharper than Pruitt's. The letter confirmed what she had feared. Thaddeus had engaged an additional attorney from the capital, a man named Driscoll with a reputation Pruitt described, when she read him the name over the telegraph that afternoon, as formidable and unpleasant. The petition would be filed at the end of the month. They had 26 days. "He's moving faster than I expected," Evelyn said. "He's worried," Bram said. She looked up. "About what?" "That you'll solve the problem." He turned the letter over in his hand. She had given it to him without thinking about it and read it again. He filed because he thought the inheritance clause gave him an easy case. "Then you got married. Now he's adjusting. He's arguing the marriage is fraudulent." "It is fraudulent," Bram said without embarrassment. "But fraud is a thing you have to prove." She studied him. "Does that bother you?" "That it's fraudulent?" He met her eyes, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read, not discomfort, not defensiveness, but something that moved underneath both of those. "It bothers me some," he said, and handed the letter back. "But I agreed to it, and I'll do what I said I'd do." She nodded and looked back at the letter. She did not ask what it bothered him about, specifically, because she was not sure she was ready to hear the answer. By the end of the 3rd week, the talk in town had moved from amusement to something more interested. People were watching Bram the way they watched any new element introduced into a system they thought they understood.
Wait to see what it would change.
Several of the ranch hands had revised their initial skepticism to something grudging. He fixed things without being asked, which Cutter appreciated more than he showed. He did not try to outrank anyone, which was unusual in a man who was, technically, married to the owner. Gideon Voss, for his part, had apparently told 2 people at the feed store that Bram Harlan would last until the court case settled, and not a day longer, at which point he'd demand his share of the property, and Evelyn would spend the next year in litigation, proving she hadn't given it to him voluntarily. Evelyn heard this second-hand through Cutter, who told her with the neutrality of a man delivering weather information. "What do you think?" she asked him. Cutter chewed on it for a moment. "I think Voss is measuring the wrong man." She filed that away and didn't say anything about it. That night she found Juniper asleep in the hallway, curled against the wall just outside Bram's closed door, her blanket pulled around her, and her cloth bag tucked under her head as a pillow. Evelyn crouched beside her. Juniper woke up immediately. She woke the way her father did, fully and all at once, with no in-between. "I fell asleep," the girl said, which was obvious, and which she said the way someone says something obvious to avoid saying the true thing. "It's cold in the hallway," Evelyn said. Juniper looked at the door. "I know." Evelyn understood with the particular clarity that comes from watching a child try to carry something too heavy for them. The girl was afraid her father would be gone when she woke up. Not lost, gone. The way people left when you weren't watching. She didn't say any of that. She just gathered Juniper up, blanket and bag and all, carried her back to her room, and tucked her in without making her explain. Then she sat beside the bed until the girl's breathing slowed into sleep. She was still there when the lamp burned down. Bram was at the corral before sunrise. Evelyn knew this because she was also awake before sunrise, sitting at her desk with Pruitt's latest letter and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention. She saw the lamp moving across the yard from her window, not the swinging light of someone hurrying, just the steady, unhurried glow of a man who woke early, because that was how he was built, not because anything was chasing him. She watched it cross the dark yard and stop at the north corral fence. She went back to Pruitt's letter. The attorney had written 3 pages to tell her, essentially, that Driscoll was better than he had initially assessed, and that the fraud argument had more traction than he'd hoped. The marriage was recent. The timing was visible. Thaddeus's side would argue that a woman who married a penniless cowboy 4 days after receiving legal notice of a contested inheritance clause was not building a household, she was building a defense. The problem was that they were right. Pruitt's advice, delivered in his customary style of careful language wrapped around unpleasant facts, was that Silver Briar needed to demonstrate the substance of a real household, not paperwork, not a name on a deed, meals together, shared management decisions, visible domestic normalcy. The kind of evidence a judge could look at and understand in under 5 minutes. She read the letter twice, set it on the desk, and looked out the window at the lamp, burning steady at the corral fence. Then she put her coat on. He heard her coming. He always seemed to. She had noticed this about him, that he was aware of his surroundings without looking like he was watching them. The way you noticed after a while that a good cattle dog always knew where the herd was without seeming to look for it. Couldn't sleep, she said. I slept fine, he said. I just don't need much. Black Banner was at the near side of the corral tonight, which was different. 3 weeks ago, the stallion had been pressed against the far fence every time a human appeared. Now he stood roughly in the middle of the space and watched Bram with the focused attention of an animal that was still deciding something. Evelyn stood beside Bram at the fence rail and looked at the horse. Pruitt wrote, I figured, from the light in your window. She told him what the letter said. Not all of it she summarized the way she summarized things for Cutter, direct and without softening, because she had found that Bram processed information the same way Cutter did, without needing her to manage how it landed. He was quiet while she talked. When she finished, he said, What does he mean by visible domestic normalcy? Meals together. Shared decisions. Looking like people who live in the same house because they chose to, not because a lawyer told them to. He was quiet again. We eat separately, he said. I know. I didn't want to presume. She turned to look at him. He was still watching the horse, his forearms on the top rail, and there was nothing defensive in his posture. He was just stating a fact about a decision he had made for reasons he considered reasonable. Bram, she said, we need to start eating together. He looked at her then. In the dark, with only the lamp between them, she couldn't read his expression precisely, but she could read the hesitation in it. All three of us. All three of us. He nodded slowly. I'll tell Juniper in the morning. I already told her, Evelyn said. Last week. She's been waiting for you to agree. Something moved across his face that might have been embarrassment, or might have been something more complicated. He turned back to the horse. She didn't say anything to me, he said. She didn't want to push you. Evelyn paused. She's very careful not to push you. He was quiet for long enough that Black Banner took 2 steps forward, head low, reading the stillness the way horses read everything, with their whole body. She worries about being too much, Bram said, eventually. He said it quietly, not to Evelyn specifically, just into the dark. I've told her she's not. I don't know if she believes me yet. Evelyn didn't respond to that. Some things didn't need a response, they just needed to be said out loud to someone who would hold them carefully, and she could do that much. Dinner tonight, she said. 7 o'clock. She walked back to the house and did not look back at the lamp. Dinner at 7 was awkward in the specific way that forced normalcy always is. 3 people sitting at a table that was built for a family, eating food that Evelyn's housekeeper May had prepared with the careful attention of a woman who understood that the stakes were higher than a meal, nobody quite sure of the choreography. Juniper sat across from her father and next to Evelyn and ate with her careful manners and said very little. Bram ate with the focused efficiency of a man who had spent years eating alone or in bunkhouses, which was to say quickly and without much conversation. Evelyn asked about the south fence repair, and the conversation found its footing there, because the south fence was a real problem with real stakes, and all 3 of them had opinions about it, including Juniper, who had been out to the south pasture 3 times in the past week, and had noticed that the post spacing in one section was wrong. The posts are too far apart for the wire gauge, the girl said, with the certainty of someone who had grown up around fences. Papa noticed it too. He didn't say anything because it was already done when we got here. Bram looked at his daughter. I was going to mention it. When? Juniper asked, not accusatory, genuinely curious. When I'd been here long enough that it didn't sound like I was criticizing. Evelyn set down her fork. Bram, if something on this ranch is wrong, I want to know. I know that. Then say it. He met her eyes. South fence. Section 4. The posts are spaced for heavy gauge and you're running light. In a strong wind, you'll lose wire before you lose his posts, and that's the wrong order. Can it be fixed? Needs additional posts in 4 places. A day's work. Then tell Cutter in the morning. He nodded. Juniper looked between them with an expression that was approximately satisfied, like a small engineer whose calculations had just been confirmed. After that, dinner was a little easier. Not easy, but easier. And Evelyn had long ago learned the difference between a problem that was solved and a problem that was being worked, and she knew which one this was, and she thought she could live with it. The writing together started the following week, not by design, but because Evelyn needed to check the upper meadows, and Bram had business in the same direction, and Juniper appeared at the stable with her coat on before anyone had told her about the plan. They rode out in the early morning with the frost still on the grass, and came back in the early afternoon with mud on their boots, and a disagreement about the condition of the upper water channel that they were still quietly arguing about when they unsaddled. Cutter watched them come in from the stable door and said nothing, which was his way of saying something. The valley watched too. Several ranch wives, who had initially sent concerned notes, had been replaced by a different kind of attention, the calculating kind, that was trying to determine whether what was happening at Silver Briar was what it looked like. Gideon Voss had visited the feed store twice in 1 week and made remarks that filtered back to Evelyn through the reliable mechanism of small-town information flow, each one a variation on the theme that penniless cowboys didn't change their nature just because they'd changed their address. Evelyn found she cared about this less than she'd expected to. What she found herself caring about more was Black Banner, who by the end of the 4th week was allowing Bram to stand within arm's reach at the fence. Not touching, just proximity. The stallion would put his head over the rail sometimes and breathe in Bram's direction, which was, as Bram explained to Juniper in Evelyn's hearing one morning, the horse trying to understand something through its best instrument. "He's learning your smell?" Juniper asked. "He's learning whether I match," Bram said. "Match what?" "Match what I act like. Horses know when something's consistent. When you're outside and you're inside are the same thing." He adjusted his position at the fence slightly. "A lot of people aren't consistent. Horses notice." Juniper thought about this. "What does an inconsistent person smell like?" "Nervous," he said. "They smell nervous and they act calm. Or they act patient, but they're actually in a hurry." Banner's been handled by people like that. People who were one thing until he did something they didn't expect, and then they were something else. Evelyn, standing a few feet back with her coffee, listened to this and thought about Gideon Voss, who had always seemed, in her experience, like a man whose patience had a bottom to it that you were never shown until you hit it. She thought, and then pushed the thought away, about whether she was one thing or two things. Whether the woman who had married Bram Harlan for a legal document was consistent with the woman who had sat beside Juniper's bed until the lamp burned out. She didn't examine that too long. "Can I try?" Juniper asked. Bram looked at her. "Same as me. No sudden moves. Don't look directly at him. Stand at the angle I showed you." Juniper positioned herself at the fence the way Bram had positioned himself, angled slightly, not facing the horse head-on, and went still with the extraordinary focused stillness of a child who was genuinely trying. Black Banner's ears moved. He took one step toward the fence. "Don't react," Bram said quietly. Juniper didn't move. Her hands were at her sides, and her jaw was set, and she was not reacting, though Evelyn could see the effort it cost her. The stallion took another step. He stretched his neck forward over the rail, nostrils working, and then very slowly, with his head still extended, he breathed across Juniper's hair. The girl let out a breath she'd been holding for a full minute. "He matched me," she said very quietly, like something that mattered. "He's starting to," Bram said. He glanced at Evelyn over Juniper's head, and the look was not triumphant, it was more careful than that. Like a man who knew how far they still had to go and didn't want to celebrate too early. But Evelyn nodded, because it was something, and they both knew it. The thing about working a difficult horse is that it requires a specific kind of faith, not in the horse exactly, but in the process, in the idea that patience applied consistently will eventually change something that force could not. Evelyn had understood this as a principle for most of her adult life. Watching Bram apply it daily made her understand it differently. Made it three-dimensional in a way that principles rarely are until you watch someone live them. She started helping. Not because Bram needed help, he was methodical and clearly knew what he was doing, but because the work was genuinely interesting, and because standing at the fence watching felt, after a while, like a form of dishonesty. She told him this. "I want to work with him too. Tell me what to do." He looked at her. "You're sure?" "Don't ask me that," she said. "Just tell me." So he told her. The angle, the stillness, the rhythm of approach that didn't feel like approach. The way to read the horse's body, ears, weight, breath, and adjust without making the adjustment visible. The difference between retreat, which conceded something, and simply pausing, which gave the horse room to make a choice. She was not as naturally quiet as Bram. She had a tendency to move with purpose, which was something she valued in herself, and which was, in this context, the wrong thing. Bram told her this without apology, just as fact, and she was annoyed for about 30 seconds, and then adjusted. Better, he said. Thank you, she said dryly. He almost smiled. She caught it at the edge, just the corner of his mouth, quickly controlled. It was the first time she had seen anything close to it, and it stayed with her longer than it probably should have. The trouble came in the 5th week. One of the younger hands, a boy named Ferris, 19, who had been on the ranch since the previous autumn and who had the particular recklessness of young men who had not yet been seriously hurt, decided that Bram's approach to the stallion was taking too long. Ferris had said this before, quietly, to other hands. What he did this particular Tuesday morning was say it with a rope. Evelyn was in her office when she heard the commotion from the North Corral. By the time she got there, Bram was already at the fence, and Ferris was inside the corral with a rope loop, trying to get it over the stallion's head, and Black Banner was in the far corner with his hindquarters to the fence, and his weight shifted back in a way that anyone who knew horses would have read immediately, as a horse preparing to kick hard enough to break something. Ferris. Bram's voice was level, not a shout, something colder than a shout, which carried further. The boy looked back. I'm just doing what should have been done, weeks ago. We've got a stallion standing in a corral eating Silver Briar's feed, and he's not broke, and he's not working. Drop the rope and walk to the gate, Bram said. He's dangerous, and somebody's going to get hurt, and I don't see why a man who's been here 5 weeks gets to. Ferris. Bram opened the gate and stepped into the corral. Evelyn's hand went to the fence rail. Bram walked toward the boy without looking at the horse. His body language was wrong for what was happening, too slow, too deliberate, like someone crossing a room at a party, rather than entering a corral with an agitated stallion in the corner. But she had watched him long enough to know that the wrongness was the point. He was not performing calm. He was delivering it. He reached Ferris, took the rope out of his hand without ceremony, and walked with him to the gate. Calm, not fast, not urgent. Black Banner did not kick. Outside the corral, Bram handed the rope to the nearest hand and looked at Ferris. Go find Cutter. Mr. Harlan, I was only. Go find Cutter, Bram said again, and something in his voice closed the conversation in a way that was not loud and was not kind. Ferris went. Bram turned and looked at Evelyn. She realized she had been gripping the fence rail hard enough to leave marks in her palm. Are you all right? She asked. Fine. He looked back at the horse, who was still in the corner, still coiled, but watching them now instead of the space they'd left. He'll need a few days to settle. That was a significant setback. I'll talk to Ferris. I already talked to him. I mean about his employment. Bram looked at her. He's young. He thought he was right. He was wrong. People are wrong when they're young. It doesn't always mean firing. She held his gaze. That's my decision to make. I know that, he said. I'm not telling you what to decide. I'm telling you what I think. She fired Ferris. She did it herself, directly, which was how she handled all the difficult conversations on Silver Briar, and she told him clearly what the line was and why he had crossed it. The boy was angry for about 10 minutes, and then honest for 30 seconds. He admitted he hadn't thought the horse could tell the difference. They can always tell the difference, Evelyn said. He left without argument. Cutter came to her office that afternoon. He sat across from her desk, which he never did. He usually stood and looked at her with the expression of a man choosing his words carefully. Something you want to say, she said. The hands are adjusting to him, Cutter said. Harlan. It's taking some of them longer than others, but they're adjusting. I know. What they're adjusting to is that he's not trying to be above them. He works the same work. He doesn't pull rank even though technically Cutter stopped. Started again. Some of them expected him to be one thing. He's another thing. What did they expect? Man who married a wealthy woman to get comfortable. He paused. That's not what he is. Evelyn looked at her desk. It's not. Gideon Voss was by the feed store again, Cutter said, in the same tone of voice, as if it were part of the same sentence. I know. He told Meeker that your husband would show his real character once the legal case settled. That all the working and the Cutter made a gesture that encompassed, apparently, Everything Bram had done in the past 5 weeks. All of it was performance. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about the morning at the corral, about Bram walking into the space with a frightened stallion to retrieve a foolish boy, about the way he had handled the rope with the calmness of a man who was not performing anything for anyone because there was no audience he was trying to impress. Gideon Voss, she said, has never done a difficult thing without an audience. Cutter almost smiled. No, ma'am. That'll be all, Cutter. He went. The legal pressure tightened at the start of the 6th week. Driscoll, Thaddeus's capital attorney, sent a formal request for documentation of the household arrangement meal schedules, shared management records, anything that would constitute evidence of a genuine domestic partnership. Pruitt delivered this to Evelyn with a covering letter that amounted to a quiet suggestion that she produce documentation she may not technically have, which was Pruitt's careful way of recommending something he couldn't put in direct terms. She discussed it with Bram that evening after dinner, when Juniper had gone upstairs. He wants us to manufacture paperwork, Bram said. He wants us to document what's real, and if what's real doesn't look like enough. She looked at him across the table. Is it real, Bram? What we've built here in the past 6 weeks. Is it something? He was quiet. Not the considering quiet, the uncomfortable kind, where a man was trying to decide whether to say the true thing. It's something, he said, finally. Whether it looks like what Driscoll expects a household to look like, I don't know. What does a household look like to you? He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Old habit, she'd noticed he did it when he was thinking, and didn't want to be obvious about it. People knowing where each other are, he said slowly. Not having to explain themselves from the beginning every time. Somebody else knowing that Juniper sleeps light and doesn't eat onions and will read anything you put in front of her if you give her enough light. He stopped. Little things. The kind you only know because you've been paying attention. Evelyn thought about the hallway. Juniper's cloth bag under her head as a pillow. She's sleeping through the night now, Evelyn said. In her room. Bram looked up. Since about the 2nd week, Evelyn said. I don't know if you noticed. He hadn't. She could see that in his face, the small shock of it, followed by something more complicated. What changed? I put a latch on her door. On the inside. She can lock it from inside, which means nobody can come in without her knowing. Evelyn picked up her coffee cup. She asked about it after she found the hallway too cold one night. I has it installed the next morning. Bram was looking at her in a way he didn't usually look at her, which was to say directly, with the kind of attention he usually reserved for horses he was trying to understand. She didn't tell me, he said. She probably didn't want you to feel responsible. He put his coffee down. When he spoke again, his voice was a little rougher than usual, which she had learned was what happened when he was moved by something, and was not going to say so directly. That was kind of you. It was practical, she said, which was not untrue. He let her have that and didn't push it. The documentation they produced for Driscoll was real. Meal records. Management logs that showed both their names on decisions. Juniper's enrollment in the county school, which Evelyn had arranged in the 3rd week at Bram's quiet request, because the girl was well beyond what traveling ranch life had given her in terms of education, and he wanted better for her. The school ledger showed her surname as Harlan and her residence as Silver Briar Ranch. When Driscoll received it, he did not respond for 4 days, which Pruitt said was not a good sign. What arrived on the 5th day was not a response to the documentation. It was a deposition notice. Thaddeus was calling witnesses. 3 ranch hands who had worked Silver Briar before the marriage. The county clerk who had performed the ceremony. And the last name on the list, Gideon Voss. Evelyn read the list twice. Voss, she said, out loud, not to anyone in particular. Bram read it over her shoulder. She had not invited this, but had stopped, somewhere in the past 2 weeks, closing documents when he walked up behind her. He'll say the marriage was arranged, Bram said. He'll say it was obvious. It was obvious. That's not the same as fraudulent. She set the notice down. Driscoll knows that. He's fishing. He's also got Voss. And Voss knows this valley and this ranch and every version of what you did and why you did it. Voss doesn't know you, she said, and then stopped, because she heard what she had said. Bram heard it too. He was quiet for a moment. No, he doesn't. Neither of them spoke. The fire in the parlor grate was the only sound, and the occasional pop of green wood catching late. She turned to face him. Tell me something Voss doesn't know. He looked at her steadily. That's a lot of territory. I know. Pick something. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to deflect, the way he deflected things that came too close, with a half answer or a redirect to practicalities. But he didn't. When Juniper was 5, he said, she stopped talking for about 3 months, after her mother died, completely. Wouldn't say a word to anyone. He paused. I didn't push it. I just kept talking to her, telling her about whatever we were doing. The horses, the weather, what we were going to eat, just so she'd know the world was still moving and I was still in it. Another pause. She started again on a Tuesday, in the middle of me explaining how to read a weather sky. Just picked up, like she'd only been waiting for the right moment. Evelyn held that. She talks a lot now, she said finally. She talks a lot now, he agreed. And there was a warmth in it that was quiet and uncomplicated and entirely his. Evelyn looked back at the deposition notice. She thought about what it meant that Gideon Voss, who had wanted Silver Briar through her, was now helping Thaddeus take it from her by other means. She thought about what it meant that the man across this table from her had come here with nothing and had not once attempted to take anything, and that this was, by the standards of the valley, apparently insufficient evidence of good character. She thought about Juniper's latch, and the south fence posts, and Black Banner taking 2 steps toward a girl standing still at a fence rail. She thought about what it was, exactly, that she was fighting for. The answer had started, somewhere in the past 6 weeks, to be more complicated than a deed. She didn't say any of this. She picked up the deposition notice and set it in the file for Pruitt. I'll need you at the courthouse, she said. I know. It will be unpleasant, I expect so. She looked at him. Are you ready for that? He picked up his coffee cup. I've been through worse things than a room full of people trying to embarrass me. He drank. I'm more worried about Banner. I don't want to break the rhythm while I'm in town. I'll work him, Evelyn said. Bram looked at her. You said you trusted me with the angle and the stillness, she said. Do you? He thought about this. Yes, he said, which cost him something. She could hear it. Not because he doubted her capability, but because the horse mattered to him the way all the lost things in his life had mattered. And he was not practiced at handing the care of things that mattered to someone else. Then go to the courthouse, she said. I'll keep the rhythm. Upstairs, a door opened and closed. Juniper moving in her room, probably reading past when she should have been asleep. Evelyn had started leaving books on the girl's windowsill without ceremony, just setting them there and not mentioning it. And Juniper had started finishing them in 3 days, and leaving them neatly stacked by the door with a careful look that was not quite gratitude, and not quite question, just acknowledgement. Bram heard it too. He glanced at the ceiling, briefly. She'll be fine, Evelyn said. I know. He said it like a man working to believe it. She will be, Evelyn said again. This is her home now. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name precisely. It was not simple. It had edges, and it was gone before she could get a clear look at it. Good night, Evelyn, he said. Good night, Bram. She listened to him go up the stairs, and then she sat alone in the parlor with the fire burning down, and she thought about the deposition and the courthouse and Gideon Voss, and she thought, underneath all of that, about a man who had walked into a corral with a dangerous horse because a foolish boy needed to be walked back out, and had not once asked her whether it was his place to do it. She did not reach any conclusions, but she sat there long enough that the fire went entirely out before she went to bed. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday, which gave them 4 days to prepare and gave Thaddeus 4 days to ensure the right people heard about it. By Wednesday, everyone in the valley had heard about it. Evelyn found this out from May, her housekeeper, who had a network of information that operated faster and more reliably than the telegraph, and who delivered the news along with breakfast with the practiced neutrality of a woman who had worked for the Ashbourne family, long enough to understand that bad news delivered gently was still bad news. Mrs. Gale's been talking, May said, setting the coffee down. Says Driscoll's been visiting the neighboring ranches, asking questions about Mr. Harlan's history. Evelyn didn't look up from Pruitt's briefing notes. What kind of questions? Where he worked before? How long in any one place? Whether anybody knows why he moved around so much. May paused. Whether anyone knows what happened to his family's land. Evelyn put the notes down. His family's land, she said. That's what she said. After May left, Evelyn sat with that for a while. Bram had told her almost nothing about his history before Silver Briar. She knew the basic facts, the daughter, the seasonal work, the circuit of ranches across 3 territories. She knew he had grown up somewhere in the north, because occasionally a word came out with a particular flatness that wasn't Montana. She knew his wife had died when Juniper was not yet 5, and she knew this the way you know something that has been told to you once and not repeated, which was to say she was careful never to bring it up. She had not known there was land. She went to find him. He was in the east stable, replacing a cracked board on one of the stall doors, and he looked up when she came in with the expression he always had when she approached, with something on her mind attentive and very slightly braced, like a man who had learned to read weather. "Driscoll has been asking about your family's land," she said. He held the board he'd been measuring, set it down. "How much do you know?" she asked. "About what Driscoll found. About your family, your history." She kept her voice even. "I need to know what he knows before Thursday, Bram. Whatever it is." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if he would answer at all. He had a talent for silences that didn't answer to pressure, not stubborn, exactly, just patient in a way that could look like the same thing. "My father was Jonas Harlan," he said finally. "He ran a horse breeding operation north of here. Good land, good water, strong bloodlines. That's where I learned most of what I know about horses." He picked up the board again, looked at it, set it back down. "About 12 years ago, a cattle syndicate came through the Northern Territories, buying up water corridors. The mountain passes, the creek routes, anything that controlled flow from the high country down into the grazing land. They needed the water rights more than the land itself controlled the water. You control who can run cattle and who can't. And your father's land had water access. His land had one of the best. Upper Spring Corridor, fed from snowmelt, ran year-round. The syndicate offered to buy. He said no. Bram looked at the stall door. They found another way. Manufactured debts, it wasn't simple, and it wasn't fast, but they had lawyers and time, and my father had neither. By the time the courts were done with him, the operation was gone. Land, stock, equipment. He died 2 years later, a pause. I was 27. Juniper's mother was pregnant with her. I had a saddle, 2 horses, and the knowledge of how the northern water corridors connected because my father had mapped every route from the time he was young, and he gave me those maps before the bank took everything else. Evelyn listened to this and understood slowly several things at once. "The mountain passage," she said. "The one that runs through Silver Briar's upper boundary." He looked at her. "It's connected to your father's maps," she said. "That's why you knew it." "I've known that corridor since I was 15, he said. "My father used it seasonally. It connects the upper spring on Silver Briar's north boundary to the old Harlan water route, which connects, if you follow it far enough, to 3 other ranches as water sources." He paused, including the Crowell property. Evelyn felt the air in the stable change. "Thaddeus," she said. "His land sits below the junction point. If someone controlled Silver Briar's upper springs, they could regulate flow to the Crowell property and everything south of it." He looked at her directly. "This was never just about your inheritance clause, Evelyn. The clause was a door. What Thaddeus wants is behind it." She stood very still. "He wants the water," she said. "He's been planning this since your father got sick. Maybe longer." The magnitude of it settled over her, like the particular cold of a room where a window has been open too long, gradual, and then suddenly impossible to ignore. Thaddeus had not come for Silver Briar because of a legal technicality. He had come because Silver Briar sat on top of water that controlled the valley, and he had found a technicality that would give him a legal path to it. "Your father's maps," she said. "Do you still have them?" "Yes, where?" He didn't answer immediately, and she understood the hesitation. This was the last thing his father had left him. And he had been carrying it for 12 years while working other men's ranches, with a daughter growing up in bunkhouses. And he had never once used it to leverage himself into anything, because using it required trusting someone with it. "Bram," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended. "I need to know what we have." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "They're in my saddlebag, the leather one I keep locked. Will you show me tonight?" "Yes," he said. And then, after a moment, "I should have told you before now." "Why didn't you?" He picked up the board a third time, and this time held it against the doorframe, checking the fit. "Because I came here to help you with your problem. I didn't want to walk through your door with mine." She didn't respond to that immediately, because the answer she had ready was too large for the moment, and she'd learned from watching him work horses that timing was its own form of honesty. She would say it when the moment was the right size. "Tonight," she said. "After dinner." He nodded. Juniper was unusually quiet at dinner that evening, which meant she had overheard something, or sensed something, or both. She was perceptive in the way of children who had spent several years as the only company a quiet man had in the evenings, which was to say she could read the temperature of a room the way a barometer reads weather accurately and without being told. She ate her meal and did not ask questions, but her eyes moved between Evelyn and her father with the focused attention of someone making calculations. After she'd gone upstairs, Bram brought the leather saddlebag to the kitchen table. The maps were old. They had been folded and refolded so many times that the crease lines had become soft like cloth, and some of the edges were worn to translucency. They were drawn in two different hands, the older sections in a careful cartographer's style, precise and detailed, the later editions in a younger hand that was still developing its confidence. Bram's own annotations were in a third hand, sparse and practical, added at the margins in what she recognized as the same writing that appeared on Silver Briar's fence repair notes. She spread them on the table. The water corridor system was more complex than she had understood from any of the official county surveys she had seen. The official maps showed the main creek systems and a handful of documented water rights. Jonas Harlan's maps showed everything else: the secondary channels, the seasonal routes, the spring sources in the high country, and how they fed into one another. The points where controlling a single access would let you regulate the downstream flow for miles. Silver Briar's upper springs were marked with a double circle. The notation beside them, in Jonas Harlan's hand, said, Primary Junction, North Valley Corridor controls flow to Crowell, Becker, and Morrison properties downstream. Morrison, Evelyn said. That's how France sold to Thaddeus 2 years ago. He's been consolidating, Bram said. He owns the lower end. He needs the upper end. She studied the map. The junction point was inside Silver Briar's boundary. Barely it sat on the north edge of the upper meadow that she and Bram had ridden out to check during their first week of riding together. She had walked past the spring access point and not understood what it was. If Thaddeus takes control of Silver Briar, she said slowly, he doesn't just get the ranch. He gets the junction. He controls water for half the North Valley. Bram leaned over the map. The Becker family has been having trouble with their water flow for 2 years. They assumed it was a dry cycle. I don't think it was. Evelyn looked up at him. You think Thaddeus has already been interfering? I think someone has. She looked back at the map. Her mind was running the implications the way she ran numbers fast, without sentiment, following each thread to where it ended. If this was correct, if Thaddeus had been systematically preparing this for years, then the legal case was not the whole fight. It was the visible part. The fraud being worked around Silver Briar was larger and older and more deliberate than a disputed inheritance clause. We need Pruitt to see these, she said. Before Thursday? Before Thursday. He rolled the maps carefully, with the practiced care of someone who understood that these were irreplaceable, and handed them to her. The gesture was not casual. She took them the same way. Bram, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said, for trusting me with them. He nodded once, which was his version of a longer answer. She had learned to read the compression. Everything he didn't say was still there. It was just folded small. She sent a rider to Pruitt before first light. The attorney arrived by mid-morning, came into her office, and spent 45 minutes with the maps spread on her desk and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, making sounds that ranged from surprised to something approaching alarmed. When he finally sat back, his expression had changed in a way she found encouraging. Pruitt alarmed was more useful than Pruitt cautious. This is significant, he said. I know it's significant. If these maps are authenticated and the water corridor connections are documented, it changes the nature of Thaddeus's claim substantially. He's not a family member protecting an inheritance concern. He's a man who has been positioning to seize a water asset. He tapped the map. This also potentially implicates the Morrison acquisition and possibly the Becker water issues. Can we use them Thursday? He hesitated. The deposition is their proceeding. But we can file a countermotion, an allegation of fraudulent intent regarding the water rights, supported by these maps and Jonas Harlan's original survey records if we can authenticate them. He looked up. Can we authenticate them? Bram knows the survey points. He's ridden every one of them. Pruitt looked toward the window, which Evelyn had learned was what he did when he was calculating risk. There is a problem, say it. If we introduce Bram Harlan's father's maps as evidence, Driscoll will investigate Jonas Harlan's history immediately. The destroyed operation, the manufactured debts, the syndicate, it will all come out. and Driscoll will use it to argue that Bram came to Silver Briar with a personal agenda. That your husband has been using this marriage to position himself to revenge his family's losses through your land. Evelyn looked at the map. That's not what happened. I know that. But it is a version of events that a competent attorney can construct, and Driscoll is more than competent. She was quiet for a moment. What's the alternative? We don't use the maps? Without the maps, we fight the fraud case on the strength of your marriage, and that case is harder than it was when Driscoll had fewer witnesses. She stood up. Then we use the maps and we fight both arguments. Pruitt looked at her. Evelyn, draw up the counter motion. I want it filed before Thursday morning. She picked up the maps and handed them to him. Handle them carefully. He took them carefully. After he left, she sat at her desk for a long time, and she thought about what Driscoll would do with the story of Wallace Jonas Harlan's ruined operation and a son who had appeared at Silver Briar with nothing but knowledge and an 8-year-old daughter. She thought about how a skilled attorney could take a true story and rotate it until it cast a completely different shadow. She thought about whether Bram had known, when he accepted her proposal, that this might happen. She decided she needed to ask him. She found him at the North Corral. He was inside the corral with Black Banner today inside, not at the fence. He was standing roughly in the center of the space, not facing the horse, and the stallion was at the far end but had his head up, and his attention fixed on the man in the middle of his space, with an alertness that was not hostile. She watched from outside the fence. She did not call to him. Over the next 10 minutes, Bram moved twice each movement, small, circular, never toward the horse, just a repositioning that changed the angle. Each time he moved, the stallion's ears shifted. Each time, Bram stopped and went still until the horse settled. On the third movement, Black Banner took 3 steps forward. Bram stopped. The horse took 2 more steps, then stopped. His nostrils were working. His weight was not shifted back. He was not preparing to flee or strike. He was leaning in, which was something different. Bram's right hand moved slowly to his side, palm forward. Not extended, just open. The stallion stretched his neck forward, and his nose found Bram's palm. He stood there for a full 30 seconds. Then he lifted his head and stepped back and wandered toward the water trough with the studied indifference of a horse who had made a decision and was not going to be dramatic about it. Bram turned and walked to the fence gate, and that was when he saw Evelyn. He came out and latched the gate. He was slightly out of breath, not from exertion, but from the kind of sustained focus that costs something. He touched, she said. First time. Bram looked back at the horse, who was drinking. He'll probably pretend it didn't happen for a day or two. Did you know? She asked. He turned from the horse. He understood that she wasn't asking about Black Banner. That Driscoll might find my father's history, he said, and use it against you. Yes. He leaned on the fence rail. I knew it was possible. I didn't know how much Driscoll would find or how fast. But you knew. Yes. He said it without flinching from it. I thought about telling you. Before we married, I decided the maps were the most useful thing I could offer you and that the rest of my history was mine to manage. He paused. I was wrong about that. It's your problem now, too. She looked at him. There was no anger in her, which surprised her. She had expected anger when she imagined this conversation. But what she felt instead was something closer to exhaustion, and underneath that, something else she wasn't going to name in a cold barnyard. I'm filing a countermotion, she said, using your father's maps. It will bring everything out. He nodded slowly. Driscoll will argue I came here with an agenda. I know. What will you argue? She looked at the stallion, who had finished drinking and was standing in the pale winter light with the collected stillness of an animal that had just done something it would need to think about. I'll argue, she said, that a man with an agenda doesn't spend 6 weeks fixing fences and working a horse and putting a latch on a little girl's door. I'll argue that the maps exist because a man's father built something real and someone took it, and that real things leave real evidence whether or not someone wants them to. She paused. And I'll argue that Thaddeus Crowell has been stealing water from this valley for 2 years, and the only reason we know it is because you walked through my door with your father's knowledge and your daughter, and your saddlebag, and not one single other thing. Bram was quiet. Is that enough? She asked. I don't know, he said honestly. I hope it is, so do I. She went back inside, and he stayed at the fence for a while longer, and the stallion watched him from across the corral, like a creature that had extended something fragile, and was waiting to see whether it would be handled well. The storm came from the north on Wednesday night, The night before the deposition, which was the kind of timing that felt personal, even though she knew it wasn't. It came fast. Montana storms in late autumn had a way of building in a matter of hours, clouds banking up against the mountains and then releasing with a violence that could change the landscape overnight. By midnight, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees and the wind had found every gap in the outbuildings. By 2 in the morning, she could hear the cattle on the north section beginning to move, which was a sound she had learned to fear, the deep collective restlessness of animals that knew something was wrong before the humans did. She was dressed and had her coat on before the first hand knocked on her door. It was Cutter, lamp in hand, face tight. "North Creek's flooding," he said. "Snowmelt coming down fast on top of yesterday's rain. The waters over the bank and the herds moving toward the east boundary. If they clear the fence line, we'll lose them in the canyon. How many hands do you have up?" "6, I need 10. Wake everyone. Get them." She stopped because Bram was already in the hallway, dressed and booted, buckling his coat. He looked at Cutter, then at her. "Where's the worst section?" he asked. "North Creek Ford," Cutter said. "But if we lose the east fence, fix the east fence first. Keep them out of the canyon." He moved past them toward the door. "I'll take 2 men and hit the ford." "The ford's dangerous in this water," Cutter said. "I know." He was already out the door. Evelyn caught Cutter's arm. "Get the men." "I'll follow Bram." "Evelyn, get the men, Cutter." The storm hit her full in the face when she stepped outside wind and ice crystals, and the particular disorienting darkness of a Montana night with thick cloud cover and no moon. She heard the cattle before she could see anything, the deep troubled sound of animals that had begun to move with the single-minded pressure of a herd that had decided on a direction. She found her horse in the stable, saddled fast, with the practiced speed of someone who had done it in the dark many times, and rode north. The creek was unrecognizable. What was normally a clear running channel, maybe 12 feet across, had become something brown and churning and wide, pulling at the banks with the heavy indifference of water that had too much mass to care about obstacles. The ford, the low water crossing they used daily, was completely submerged, the marker posts visible only as slight disturbances in the current. Bram was on the bank with 2 hands, Denny and a boy named Cole, looking at the water. "We can't cross here," Cole said. He was 20, and in the lamplight he looked younger. "We don't need to cross," Bram said. "We need to redirect the herd before they hit the east section." He pointed upstream. "There's a higher crossing 200 yards up. It'll be rough, but it's above the flood line." "I know that crossing," Denny said. "I've used it in dry season." In this water it's bad," Bram said. "I know, but it's the crossing we have." He looked at Evelyn, who had come up beside them. "Can you take the east line? Keep them from the canyon while we try to come around?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her for 1 moment longer than the situation required, which she understood it was the same look he gave anything he was handing care of over to someone else. The look that was not doubt. Just the acknowledgement that he was trusting something that mattered. "Be careful at the bank," he said. "The edge will be soft." "Go," she said. She rode east. The work of managing a panicked herd in the dark in a storm is not dramatic in the way that stories make it. It is loud and wet and deeply unglamorous, and the primary tools are your horse's steadiness and your own refusal to add to the chaos. Evelyn had done this work most of her adult life, and she fell into it now with the focus of someone switching off everything except what the next 30 seconds required. The east fence held, barely. 2 posts had gone soft in the saturated ground and were leaning, and if the herd had hit them with any real momentum, they would have gone through. She got there ahead of the cattle by 3 minutes, which was enough to begin turning the lead animal's older cows, who, if you caught them right, would change direction and take the rest of the herd with them. She caught them right. It took 40 minutes to redirect the bulk of the herd back toward the home pasture. She lost track of time. Her horse lost footing twice in the mud and recovered both times, and she stayed on because she had been staying on through rough footing her whole life, and because there was too much to do to consider anything else. She was turning the last of the stragglers when she heard the shout from the direction of the creek. It was Denny's voice, high and wrong. She rode hard. She found them on the bank above the higher crossing. Cole was on his horse, pale. Denny was on his feet, pointing at the water. Bram was in the creek. He had gone in at the crossing point, and the bank had collapsed under his horse. She could piece it together from what she saw in the next seconds, and the horse had made it, but he had not, and he was in the current now. One arm hooked over a submerged log that was itself moving, fighting the pull of water with the particular desperation of a man who was losing ground. "Get a rope!" she shouted at Cole, who was already reaching for his saddle. But Bram had gotten his feet under him. The current was chest-deep at the bank's edge, less deeper in, and he had found gravel and was pushing himself to shallows with every bit of whatever he had left, and she could see it costing him. The water was cold enough to kill in time, and the footing was uncertain, and he was doing it by force of will rather than by any favorable conditions. He made the shallower water. He made the bank. He came up over the edge and collapsed onto his hands and knees in the mud and stayed there for a moment, coughing water. She was off her horse and beside him before she had consciously decided to move. Bram. She got her arm under his shoulder. He was shaking, full body shaking, the uncontrolled kind that comes from cold that has gone deep enough to frighten the body. "Can you stand?" Yes, he stood. It cost him. "Your horse?" Other side. He looked across the creek. His horse was visible on the far bank, standing, which was good news. Getting it back was tomorrow's problem. "You need to get warm," she said. "The herd is mostly home." I turned the east section. She kept her arm under his. He had not shrugged her off, which told her how bad the cold was. Cutter's got the rest. "You need to get to the house." He didn't argue, which was another measure of how serious the cold had gotten into him. The ride back was slow. She kept close to him and watched for the particular signs, the confusion, the stillness that meant cold had passed from dangerous to critical. He stayed present. His shaking lessened as they rode, and the movement warmed him minimally, enough. At the house, she got him inside, and had May, who had stayed up through the whole crisis, and had hot water on the stove, as if she had anticipated this exact scenario, get blankets and the basin of warm water. She sat Bram in the chair closest to the kitchen fire and made him take the coffee May brought, and she did not give him the option of refusing any of it. He sat and let all of it happen, which was unlike him, and she watched his color come back slowly and thought about the creek bank and what Denny's shout had sounded like and the specific quality of her own fear in the seconds between that shout and finding him in the water. She had been afraid before. She had been afraid for the ranch, for the cattle, for the outcome of the legal case. That fear was a known thing, a cold and calculated thing that she could work with. This had not been that. Juniper appeared in the kitchen doorway, in her nightgown, hair loose, eyes wide and already knowing that something had happened. Bram looked up at her. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was still a little rough. "You're all wet," she said. "I went in the creek." Juniper crossed the kitchen and put her hand on his arm, the way she did when she was checking something, rather than expressing comfort, a quick, firm contact that confirmed what was there. Then she stood beside his chair and looked at Evelyn. "Is the herd all right?" she asked. Evelyn looked at this 8-year-old girl, who asked about the herd first, and recognized in the question every year her father had spent teaching her what mattered and in what order. "Most of them," Evelyn said. "We'll count in the morning." Juniper nodded. She pulled up the stool from beside the stove and sat down next to Bram's chair, close enough to touch, and that was where she stayed. Bram put his hand on top of her head. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. The fire crackled and the storm pressed at the windows and the house held. Evelyn poured herself coffee and stood at the window and thought about the deposition in 8 hours and about Driscoll and his witnesses and about the North Corral where a black stallion was standing through the storm in a space where, not 6 weeks ago, he had allowed no human to stand close enough to touch him. She thought about what Bram had said, about people who were one thing until something unexpected happened and then became something else. She thought about who she was in the moment she had heard Denny shout. She already knew the answer. She had known it, she realized, for longer than she had let herself admit, had known it in the way you know the shape of something in the dark before you can see it clearly, which is not the same as not knowing. She did not say any of it out loud. She drank her coffee and watched the storm and let Bram get warm, and outside, Silver Briar held its ground against the weather the way it had held its ground for 30 years against everything that had come for it, because the land itself had no opinion about what was difficult and what was not. It simply continued. In the morning, they would go to the courthouse. They left for the courthouse before the storm had fully released its grip on the valley. The roads were soft from the night's rain, and the horses moved carefully through the mud, and nobody talked much on the ride into town. Evelyn rode with Pruitt, who had met them at the Silver Briar gate with his satchel and his careful expression. Bram rode slightly behind, and Evelyn could see from the set of his shoulders that the creak had cost him more than he was going to say. He moved with the particular stiffness of a man whose body was settling a debt from the night before. She had asked him, before they left, whether he was well enough. He had said yes in the tone that meant the question was closed. She had not pushed it, because she had learned what pushing got her with Bram Harlan, which was a polite and absolute wall. The courthouse was a 2-story stone building at the center of town that smelled of pine tar and old paper. And when they arrived, there were already people in the gallery more than a legal proceeding of this nature should have drawn, which told her that Thaddeus had understood the value of an audience and had made sure one was present. She saw Thaddeus at the front of the room, standing near his attorney's table, with the composed expression of a man who had spent the past 6 weeks being confident. Driscoll stood beside him, a tall, spare man in a dark suit, who looked at everything in the room with the measuring attention of someone calculating what was useful to him. She saw Gideon Voss in the second row of the gallery, which was where she had expected him. He met her eyes and nodded once, not unkindly, which was worse than if he had been hostile, the nod of a man who had convinced himself he was a witness to something regrettable rather than a participant in something deliberate. Bram saw him too. He said nothing. They sat at their table, and Pruitt arranged his papers, and Evelyn put her hands flat on the table and looked straight ahead, and reminded herself that she had been in difficult rooms before. She had been in rooms with men who thought her father's illness meant Silver Briar was available for renegotiation. She had been in rooms with drought assessors and bank representatives, and a cattle fever inspector who had suggested, delicately, that the loss of her herd might simply be something she needed to absorb. She had walked out of all of them with what she came in with. She intended to do it again. Judge Alderman was 63, a Montana territorial man who had been on the bench for 20 years and who had, according to Pruitt, a low tolerance for legal theater and a high tolerance for evidence. Pruitt considered this favorable. Evelyn was reserving judgment. Driscoll opened with a precision that told her he had prepared extensively. He laid the foundation carefully, the inheritance clause, its language and intent, the timeline of Evelyn's marriage relative to the date of legal notice. He spoke about it the way you lay a foundation under a building, quietly, without flourish, because what he was building on top of it was the part he wanted people to look at. Then he called his first witness. The county clerk confirmed the date of the marriage, the absence of any previous announced intention to marry, the 4-day interval between legal notice and ceremony. He answered every question without embellishment and left the stand looking mildly apologetic. The 2 former ranch hands were next. They testified about the arrangement. Both had left Silver Briar before the marriage and had heard secondhand, through the valley's reliable channels, that the marriage was a protective arrangement. Neither had witnessed anything directly. Driscoll used them to establish the community's understanding of what had happened, which was its own kind of evidence. Then he called Gideon Voss. Voss took the stand with the ease of a man who was accustomed to being looked at and considered the attention his due. He was well dressed, as always. He folded his hands in his lap and answered Driscoll's questions with the measured certainty of a man who had rehearsed his honesty. "How long have you known Evelyn Ashbourne?" Driscoll asked. 12 years, since before her father's decline. "Would you characterize her as a careful businesswoman?" "One of the most careful I've encountered." "Is it your opinion that she would make a significant personal decision of marriage without careful calculation of its business implications?" Pruitt was on his feet. "Objection. Calls for speculation." "I'll allow it," Alderman said. "Witness may answer." Voss looked at Evelyn when he answered. She held his gaze. "No," he said. "Evelyn Ashbourne does not make decisions without understanding their consequences. She is one of the most deliberate people I know. So in your opinion, the marriage to Bram Harlan was a deliberate decision. Everything she does is deliberate, including the timing." "I would assume so." Driscoll let that sit for a moment. "Then, what do you know of Bram Harlan prior to his arrival at Silver Briar?" "He was a seasonal hand, moved from ranch to ranch. I'd heard the name. You hear most names in this valley eventually. I didn't know him personally. Did you find it unusual that a woman of Miss Ashbourne's standing would choose to marry a man of his?" "I found it surprising," Voss said carefully. "Not inexplicable, given the circumstances." "Given the legal circumstances." "Yes." Driscoll nodded and stepped back. "Thank you, Mr. Voss." Pruitt's cross-examination of Voss was brief, and Evelyn thought, not quite sufficient. He established that Voss had no direct evidence of any arrangement being stated, No document, no witnessed conversation. Voss acknowledged this without difficulty, because he hadn't claimed to have any. What he had offered was an opinion dressed as observation. An opinion was harder to cross-examine than fact. Voss left the stand without looking at Bram. Then Driscoll turned to the room and said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man playing his strongest card last, I'd like to call Bram Harlan. Evelyn put her hand briefly on Bram's arm. She didn't say anything. He looked at her hand, then at her face, then stood up. He walked to the stand without hurrying. He sat down with the stillness he brought to everything, not tense, not performing relaxation, just present the way a man is present when he has decided there is nowhere else to be. Driscoll approached him. Mr. Harlan, you arrived at Silver Briar Ranch approximately 8 weeks ago. That's right. Prior to that, you had worked seasonal ranch positions across 3 territories for approximately 3 years. Yes. During that period, you owned no land. No. No fixed property of any kind. No. And prior to that 3-year period, where were you, Mr. Harlan? A slight pause. Working similar positions. For how long? Several years. So for the better part of a decade, you have been a man without property, without fixed residence, moving from one temporary employment to the next. Driscoll's voice was entirely neutral. That was his skill. The absence of contempt was more effective than contempt, because it left no hook for the witness to push against. What did you bring to Silver Briar Ranch when you arrived? My daughter, my horse, my tools. That was the sum of your assets. Yes. And within 4 days of your arrival, you were married to the owner of a 6,000-acre ranch with documented water rights and a horse operation valued at. Driscoll consulted his notes. Considerable sum. That's the timeline, yes. And the marriage was proposed by Miss Ashbourne. Yes. She came to you. Yes, she explained the inheritance clause and its implications. She did, and you agreed to the marriage. I did. Driscoll stepped slightly closer. Mr. Harlan, at the time you agreed to marry Evelyn Ashbourne, did you have any knowledge of the Silver Briar Water Corridor system and its connection to the broader Valley Water Rights Network? The room shifted. Not loudly, a subtle collective adjustment, the gallery leaning slightly forward. Bram looked at Driscoll steadily. Yes, Driscoll let that land. You did. I did. And did you disclose this knowledge to Miss Ashbourne before agreeing to the marriage? A pause. No, you withheld it. I didn't disclose it immediately. Mr. Harlan. Driscoll's voice remained even. You arrived at Silver Briar with specific knowledge of a water corridor system that is now central to a counterclaim filed by your wife's attorney, a counterclaim that, if successful, would significantly benefit Silver Briar's legal position. You did not disclose this knowledge before the marriage. Is that accurate? It's accurate. And your father, Jonas Harlan, had a documented conflict with a water syndicate connected to parties with interests in the Silver Briar corridor. My father lost his operation through fraudulent debt. Yes. So you had personal reason to be interested in the Silver Briar water corridor. My father had maps. I knew what the corridor connected to. That's different from having an agenda, is it? Driscoll turned to face the room briefly, then back. You came to Silver Briar with no property, no money, and knowledge that could be leveraged in a legal proceeding to benefit a ranch you were about to marry into. You did not disclose that knowledge until after the marriage was legal and the counterclaim was necessary. He paused. From the outside, Mr. Harlan, how would you characterize that? Bram was quiet for a moment. From the outside, he said, I imagine it looks calculated. And from the inside? Another pause. Longer this time. The room was very quiet. From the inside, Bram said, it looks like a man who had spent years carrying something heavy and wasn't sure yet who he could set it down with. Driscoll's expression didn't change. He was too good for that. But he had expected a different kind of answer, and the recalibration was visible for just a moment before he moved on. Your daughter is enrolled in the county school under the address of Silver Briar Ranch, Driscoll said. Yes. She is 8 years old. Yes. If the court were to rule against Silver Briar's household claim, your daughter would lose her enrolled address. Yes. So you also have familial reasons to want this proceeding to succeed. I have a daughter who finally has a room with a lock on the door, Bram said. Yes. I have reasons. Driscoll looked at him for a moment. Then he said, no further questions, and walked back to his table. Pruitt's redirect was careful and thorough. He walked Bram through the maps, their origin, their content, their documentation of the water corridor system. He established that Jonas Harlan's survey records were independently verifiable through county records in the Northern Territory. He asked about the Becker family's water flow disruptions, and Bram answered with the specificity of someone who had spent years thinking about the corridor, and the room listened with the particular attention of people who were beginning to understand that the case in front of them was larger than they had arrived expecting. Then Driscoll called Thaddeus to the stand. Thaddeus Crowell testified with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed extensively and trusted his own performance. He spoke about the inheritance clause as a matter of legal principle, the original intent, the documented language, the territorial precedent. He spoke about his concern for Silver Briar as a family legacy, which was delivered with such complete conviction that Evelyn had to admire it in a cold way, the way you admire a piece of machinery that functions perfectly in service of something harmful. Pruitt cross-examined him on the Morrison acquisition. Thaddeus was ready for that. He had explanations, reasonable, plausible, documented explanations for why he had purchased the Morrison property and what his intentions for it were. Pruitt went deeper. He produced the Harlan maps and asked Thaddeus to identify the junction point. "I'm not familiar with the survey notation," Thaddeus said. "The property you purchased from the Morrison family sits immediately downstream of this junction point." Pruitt tapped the map. Controlling the junction would give the Crowell property regulatory influence over water flow to 3 neighboring properties. That's a theoretical construction. Is it? The Becker family has documented a 40% reduction in their water flow over the past 2 years. This map shows that a blockage at this point, Pruitt indicated, would produce exactly that reduction. He looked at Thaddeus. "Are you aware of any obstruction at the upper Silver Briar Springs?" "I am not." "Have you directed anyone to create an obstruction?" "Absolutely not." "Then you won't object to a county survey of the spring access point." Thaddeus looked at Driscoll. Driscoll gave a small shake of his head that was meant to be invisible and wasn't. "I have no objection to a survey," Thaddeus said smoothly. But the hesitation had been there, and Judge Alderman had seen it. Pruitt sat down. The room took a breath. Then Driscoll stood for his closing argument, and it was everything Evelyn had anticipated and braced for. He built it calmly, methodically, and with the skill of a man who understood that a jury, even a judge, needed a story, and that the story he was offering was simpler and more satisfying than the one Pruitt had presented. A wealthy woman faced a legal threat. A penniless man arrived with hidden knowledge. A marriage was arranged. The hidden knowledge became a legal counterclaim that benefited the wealthy woman's position. The penniless man's daughter got a stable home. Every element of this arrangement, Driscoll said, serves the interests of one party or both. There is no element that is not explicable as calculation. And when every element of a marriage is explicable as calculation, the court must ask what element, if any, is not. He looked at the gallery, then at Alderman. "Evelyn Ashbourne is a careful and deliberate woman. Gideon Voss told you so, and he was right. She is also a woman who, faced with a genuine legal threat, found a man who had something she needed and made an arrangement that served them both." He paused. "That is not a household. That is a transaction. And a transaction, however well documented, does not satisfy a legal household requirement." He sat down. Pruitt stood. His opening was quieter than Driscoll's, which was deliberate. He had told Evelyn beforehand that he intended to undercut the theater, not compete with it. He went through the documentation, the meal records, the school enrollment, the shared management logs, the fence repairs, the medical record of Bram's treatment after the creek incident. He presented the Harlan maps and the authenticated survey connections and the Becker water flow records. He presented, carefully, the timeline of Thaddeus's property acquisitions and their spatial relationship to the Silver Briar Springs. And then he said, "I'd like to call Evelyn Harlan to the stand." She heard her married name spoken in a formal legal context for the first time, and something in it hit differently than she expected. She walked to the stand. Driscoll's cross-examination of her was efficient and targeted. He established the timeline she had already established. He asked about the clause, the legal notice, the 4 days. He asked whether she had considered other candidates for marriage before approaching Bram. "Yes," she said. "And you chose a man with no property over men of considerable means." "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because the men of considerable means wanted Silver Briar. Bram Harlan didn't, and that was sufficient reason for marriage. At the time, it was the primary one. At the time, he repeated. Has that changed?" A pause. The room was very quiet again. "Yes," she said. Driscoll looked at her. Whatever he saw there made him decide not to push that particular line further. He sat down. Pruitt stood. Mrs. Harlan, do you love your husband? Driscoll, objection. Irrelevant to the legal question of household validity. Alderman looked at Pruitt. Counsel? The opposing argument, Pruitt said, is that no element of this marriage is explicable outside of calculation. I am asking whether that argument is complete. Alderman considered. I'll allow it. Pruitt looked at her. The courtroom was as quiet as the house at 3 a.m. when she had sat beside Juniper's bed until the lamp burned out. Evelyn looked at Bram, who was at the table, and his face was the face of a man who had learned not to need things too openly, because needing things openly had cost him before. She looked back at Pruitt. Yes, she said. She heard Thaddeus's lawyer make a small noise. She heard the gallery shift. She kept going, because she had started and stopping halfway was not how she operated. I married Bram Harlan because I needed a name on a document, and he was willing to provide one. That's true. But truth is not always finished when you first state it. She looked at Alderman. My uncle's argument assumes that a marriage cannot become something more than the reason it began. I'm asking the court to consider whether that assumption is correct. She paused. Bram Harlan spent 6 weeks on my ranch refusing the office I offered him, eating in the kitchen before I asked him not to, fixing fences nobody told him were broken, and walking into a corral with a dangerous horse because a young hand needed to be walked back out safely. He put a latch on his daughter's door when she was frightened, and he did it without telling me or expecting me to notice. She stopped. He went into a flooded creek in the middle of a storm last night to save this ranch's herd, and when I found him on the bank, he asked about the horse he'd had to leave on the other side before he asked about anything else. She looked at Thaddeus, who was watching her with the expression of a man recalculating. My uncle is arguing that this marriage is fraudulent. What I am telling the court is that a fraud generally involves someone taking something. In 8 weeks, Bram Harlan has not taken one thing that wasn't offered to him first. The room was still. Alderman looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had been reading people from that bench for 20 years, and she held his gaze and let him read whatever he found. Thank you. Mrs. Harlan, Pruitt said quietly. No further questions. She walked back to her seat. Bram didn't look at her directly, but his hand was on the table, and when she sat down she put hers beside it, not touching, just close, and he didn't move his away. Alderman called a recess, and the room exhaled. Thaddeus crossed the room during the recess to where Evelyn stood near the window. He came without his attorney, which told her something. You've made this considerably more complicated than it needed to be, he said quietly. You made it complicated when you decided a water junction was worth more than your brother's ranch. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, not guilt, exactly, but the acknowledgement that the version of himself he had been presenting to the room was not the only one available. The clause was legitimate, he said. The clause was a door you spent years looking for a key to, she said. The water was always what you wanted. He was quiet. If the survey finds what I think it will find, she said, you will have a larger problem than this proceeding. He straightened his coat. We'll see what the survey finds. He walked away. Pruitt appeared at her shoulder. He's worried. I know. The hesitation when I asked about the survey. I saw it. If the obstruction is there and it's not natural, then this stops being a civil case, she said. Pruitt nodded, slowly. When the recess ended and Alderman returned to the bench, Driscoll asked for a delay in judgment pending further evidence gathering, which was the move of a man who understood that the momentum of the room had shifted and wanted time to find footing. Alderman denied it. He said, from the bench, in the measured tone of a man who had seen enough legal proceedings to find theater tiresome, that he had heard sufficient testimony to make a preliminary ruling on the household claim, and that the water rights question would be referred for independent county survey, the results of which would determine whether additional proceedings were warranted. He looked at his notes. The claim by Thaddeus Crowell that the Silver Briar household arrangement fails to meet the requirements of the inheritance clause, he said, is not supported by the evidence presented. The documentation of shared residence, shared management, and shared domestic life is sufficient under territorial precedent. The timing of the marriage, while notable, does not by itself constitute fraud-absent evidence of a formal arrangement to deceive, and the testimony offered has not risen above the level of inference and opinion. Thaddeus's face did not change. He had good control. The household claim is denied, Alderman said. Silver Briar Ranch remains under the ownership and management of Evelyn Harlan, née Ashbourne. A county survey of the Upper Spring access will be conducted within 30 days, and this court reserves jurisdiction over any findings that may arise from that survey. He set his notes down. We're adjourned. The sound in the room was not quite applause, something more restrained than that. The collective exhale of a gallery that had expected something dramatic and had gotten something quieter and more complicated, which was usually how real things went. Evelyn sat at the table and did not move for a moment. Pruitt was gathering papers beside her, making the sounds of a satisfied man trying to be professional about it. Across the room, Driscoll was speaking quietly to Thaddeus, and from the angle of Thaddeus's shoulders, she could see that the conversation was not the one he had expected to be having after today. She turned to Bram. He was looking at the bench, still, his expression not triumphant. More like a man who had taken a breath and was deciding whether he could let it out yet. We won, she said. Preliminary ruling, he said. Bram. He looked at her. We won, she said again. Something eased in his face. Not a smile too complex for that. Just the release of something that had been held tight for a long time. The survey, he said. We'll find what we think it will find. The obstruction is there. I'm certain of it. And then Thaddeus has a different kind of problem. She paused. A much larger one. Outside the courthouse, the valley's winter light was thin and pale, and the mud from the previous night's storm had frozen at the edges into a crust that crunched underfoot. Cutter was waiting with the horses, stamping his feet against the cold, and when he saw them come through the door, he read their faces and nodded once. How bad, he said. We won, Evelyn said. Cutter let out a breath that was mostly relief, and partly something he would not have admitted to. The herds counted, he said. Lost 11 head in the canyon. Could have been worse. I know. Banner's all right. Stayed in the corral through the whole thing. He glanced at Bram. Your horse made it back this morning. Denny found him on the north bank. Bram looked at Cutter. Thank you. I didn't do anything, Cutter said. Horse came back on his own. Juniper was at Silver Briar when they arrived home, having spent the day with May, who had apparently kept her occupied with an extensive baking project of unclear purpose. She came to the door when she heard the horses, and looked at her father's face and then at Evelyn's face with the measuring attention she brought to everything that mattered. Did you win? She asked. For now, Bram said. She looked at Evelyn. For now, Evelyn confirmed, is enough. Juniper absorbed this with her characteristic seriousness. Then she said, May and I made 4 pies. 4, Evelyn said. I didn't know how many to make. I wanted to be ready. She paused. I thought winning might need more than one. Bram looked at his daughter for a moment, with an expression that was not complicated at all. It was the simplest thing on his face she had seen yet, and she had been watching his face for 8 weeks. He put his arm around Juniper's shoulders and they went inside. Evelyn stood in the yard for a moment longer, in the thin winter light, and looked at Silver Briar, the stable, the corrals, the house, the long slope of land running north toward the mountains. 6,000 acres, water rights that controlled the North Valley. A black stallion standing quiet in the near corral, watching the yard with his ears forward. She had won today. She knew the ground was not settled. The survey would come, and whatever it found would open new fronts. Thaddeus did not lose gracefully, and Driscoll was not finished, and the valley had a long memory for the shape of a fight, but she had won today. And inside the house, 3 people who had come together for reasons that were entirely practical were sitting down to more pie than any victory strictly required, which was its own kind of evidence that something had changed from what it had started as. She went inside. May had already set the table. The 4 pies lasted 2 days, which was longer than anyone expected and shorter than Juniper had planned for. She had made them with the seriousness she brought to everything that mattered, and she had arranged them on the kitchen sideboard, with the careful symmetry of a child who understood that presentation was a form of respect. May had let her do it without interference, which was its own kind of gift. The morning after the courthouse, Silver Briar went back to work. This was not a decision anyone made aloud. It was simply what happened, because the cattle still needed feeding, and the creek damage still needed assessing, and Black Banner still needed the daily rhythm that Bram had built around him with the patience of a man who understood that trust, once extended, required maintenance. The ranch did not pause for legal victories, and the people who ran it had never expected it to. Bram was at the corral before breakfast, moving stiffly from the cold that had gotten into him during the creek crossing, though he would not have used the word stiffly and would have disputed anyone who did. Evelyn saw it from the kitchen window, the slight hesitation before he swung up onto the fence rail, the careful way he held his left shoulder. She said nothing about it. She had learned which things he would accept help with and which he would not, and physical limitation fell firmly in the second category. The survey team arrived from the county office 11 days after the ruling. There were 3 of them, a surveyor named Aldrich and 2 assistants, and they spent 4 days on the upper meadow and the spring access point, moving methodically through the terrain with their instruments and their notebooks while Bram walked them through every point on Jonas Harlan's maps. Evelyn watched from a distance on the first day and then went back to running the ranch, because hovering accomplished nothing, and she had 11 years of experience proving that anxiety was less useful than action. On the 4th day, Aldrich came to her office. He was a compact, careful man who spread feuilletons on her desk with the precision of someone who had spent a career learning to deliver uncomfortable information without editorializing. He showed her the obstruction, a deliberate rock and timber diversion, constructed at the secondary channel junction that had been redirecting roughly a third of the spring flow away from its natural downstream course for what he estimated was 18 to 24 months. It wasn't a natural formation, he said. The construction is too deliberate. Someone who understood the hydrology built this. And the downstream effect? Consistent with the reduction the Becker property has documented. He paused. There's also evidence of a second diversion, partial, further up the slope. It's less developed. I think it was in progress. Evelyn looked at the survey diagram. The second diversion, if completed, would have captured the main spring flow and redirected it toward the Crowell property's upper boundary. When you file your report, she said, who receives a copy? County assessor, territorial land office, and any party with a documented water rights claim in the affected corridor. He looked at her, which would include the Becker family. Good, she said. She sent Pruitt the survey results that afternoon, with a letter that was 3 sentences long, because 3 sentences was all it required. The facts were sufficient without decoration. Pruitt's response came 2 days later and was considerably longer than 3 sentences. He outlined the implications. The constructed obstruction constituted interference with documented water rights, which was a territorial offense. The incomplete second diversion suggested premeditation. Combined with the timeline of Thaddeus's property acquisitions and Driscoll's deposition arguments, the pattern was difficult to explain innocently. Thaddeus, Pruitt wrote at the end, would need better lawyers than Driscoll for what was coming next. Evelyn read the letter twice, filed it, and went out to the corral. Bram was inside the pen with Black Banner. Not standing at a distance today close, moving around the horse with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man working a puzzle from the inside. The stallion was tracking him with his ears and occasionally turning his head to keep Bram in view, which was entirely different from the horse in the far corner from 8 weeks ago. This was a horse paying attention to someone it had decided was worth attending to. She leaned on the fence rail and watched. After a while, Bram put his hand on the stallion's neck. Flat palm, steady pressure. Black Banner's skin twitched once, the reflex, the old alarm, and then settled. He dropped his head slightly, the way horses do when something releases. Bram stood there with his hand on that black neck for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. Survey came back, she said. I know. Aldrich talked to me this morning. He kept his hand on the horse. What did Pruitt say? That Thaddeus is going to need better lawyers. He nodded slowly. He looked back at the stallion. My father spent 2 years trying to prove the syndicate had manufactured the debts. He couldn't move fast enough, and he didn't have the documentation to make it stick. He paused. He had the maps, but he didn't have anyone who would stand behind them with him. Evelyn understood what he was saying underneath what he was saying. She had been learning to do that for weeks, reading the compression. The things folded small. He would have known, she said, that it mattered. What you kept. Bram was quiet for a moment. Maybe. Not maybe. She put her hand on the fence rail. The map saved Silver Briar. And the Becker family's water. And probably 2 other properties downstream that don't know it yet. She paused. He gave you the right thing. He didn't answer immediately. The stallion shifted his weight and Bram moved with it, adjusting without pulling away, and she watched the 2 of them calibrate to each other and thought that this was what it looked like when patience actually worked. Not a dramatic breakthrough, just a gradual settling, one small adjustment at a time, until the distance that had been there was simply gone. He'll carry a rider by spring, Bram said about the horse. I know, she said. He looked at her. You've been working him in the mornings. When I've been on the east section. I told you I would. I know. He turned from the fence. He responds to you differently than he did. Differently how? He's not performing patience for you anymore. He's just comfortable. Bram said it like a fact he was reporting, neutral and direct, and she understood that he was talking about the horse and also about something else, and that he probably knew she understood this and had said it anyway, which was its own kind of step. She let it stand. The legal consequences for Thaddeus unfolded over the following 6 weeks, with the grinding inevitability of territorial law moving against a man who had been too careful for too long and had finally been careless in the wrong direction. The obstruction finding triggered a water rights investigation. The investigation connected to the Morrison acquisition in the way that Pruitt had argued it would. Thaddeus's attorneys, the better ones he had retained after Driscoll declined to continue, negotiated where they could and conceded where they couldn't, which was most places. By February, Thaddeus Crowell had been assessed with significant fines for water rights interference, had surrendered the Morrison property under a forced resale agreement, and was facing a civil suit from the Becker family that Pruitt estimated would take 2 years to resolve and not in Thaddeus's favor. He did not come back to Silver Briar. Evelyn did not expect him to, and she did not spend much time thinking about what he felt or what he had learned, because she had always found that the most efficient use of the energy spent on people who had tried to take things from her was redirecting it toward the things she was building. Silver Briar had a lot of building to do. The storm damage took most of January to repair properly. 3 sections of fencing, 2 outbuilding roofs, and a portion of the main stable's north wall that had taken water during the worst of it. Bram organized the repair work with Cutter in the easy shorthand they had developed over months of working problems from opposite ends and meeting in the middle, and Evelyn found herself stepping back from the logistics in a way she hadn't stepped back from anything in 11 years. Not because she couldn't manage it, because she found that she didn't have to, and the difference between those two things was larger than she had anticipated. Juniper turned 9 in early February, and Evelyn asked her what she wanted for her birthday. The girl thought about it for 2 days with the seriousness she applied to everything, and then came to Evelyn's office and sat in the chair across from the desk, not perched nervously, the way she had sat in that chair in the early weeks, but settled, with her feet on the floor and her hands in her lap, like someone who had decided the chair was hers to use. I want to learn to read the water maps, Juniper said. Papa's father's maps. I want to understand what they show. Evelyn looked at her. That's what you want for your birthday? Yes. Not a new dress or books, or I have books. May gave me 2 last week. She paused. I want to understand the maps because Papa knows them and I want to know what he knows. Evelyn held that for a moment. Then she said, I'll talk to your father. Bram's response when she told him that evening was to be quiet for a moment and then go find the maps in the saddlebag that had moved, sometime in the past 2 months, from being locked to being simply stored on the shelf in his room, alongside books in Juniper's spare coat, and the small collection of objects that accumulate around people who have finally stopped preparing to leave. They spread the maps on the kitchen table the following Saturday, all 3 of them, and Bram walked Juniper through the corridor system, the same way Jonas Harlan had walked him through it at 15, with the patience of a man passing something forward that he understood was worth more than the paper it was drawn on. Evelyn sat across the table and listened, and there was a particular quality to the afternoon that she could not have described precisely, but recognized in the way you recognize the smell of spring, something returning that you had not quite let yourself expect. It was in the middle of this, Bram tracing a secondary channel on the map, while Juniper followed in of his finger, with the focused attention of a student who had already understood more than she was showing, that Evelyn looked at them across the kitchen table and understood, with the quiet finality of something that has been true for a while finally being acknowledged, that she was not afraid anymore. Not of Thaddeus, not of the claws or the court or the things people in the valley said about her and her arrangement and the penniless cowboy she had married. Not of the question that had been sitting underneath everything for months, the one she had been circling without approaching directly. She was not afraid. It was the absence of fear that clarified everything. She had made a decision 2 months ago from a position of fear of losing the ranch, fear of Thaddeus's lawyers, fear of the clause and what it meant. And in deciding from fear, she had accidentally made the right decision, which she supposed was the kind of thing that happened sometimes. if you were lucky, or careful, or both. But Bram had said it himself, in that courtroom. He loved her too much to spend the rest of his life wondering whether she kept him because she once needed him. She had not heard that sentence and filed it away. She had heard it and carried it every day since, turning it over the way you turn over, something that changes shape depending on the angle. He was right. He deserved better than that. So did she. That evening, after Juniper had gone to bed and May had gone home, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, she went to find Bram. He was in the parlor with a cup of coffee, which had become his evening habit, not because she had asked him to use the parlor, but because at some point he had simply started, without announcement, and she had not said anything, because she found she didn't want to. She sat down across from him. He looked at her with the attentiveness he had when he understood that something was coming, and waited. She had thought about how to say it, and had decided that there was no version that wasn't awkward, and that awkward was better than unclear, and that she had spent too long in her life choosing precision over the messier kind of truth. I need to say something, she said, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. He nodded. When I came to you at Kellerman's, she said, I told you I needed a name on a document. That was true. And you came here and you did that, and you did considerably more than that. And the ranch is safe, and Thaddeus is finished, and the water is going where it should be going. She paused. All of that is done. You held up your end of the arrangement, every part of it. He was watching her carefully, not speaking. What I need to tell you, she said, is that somewhere in the past 3 months I stopped being a woman who was grateful for your help and became something else. I don't know the exact day. I think it might have been the night I found Juniper in the hallway, or the morning at the corral fence, when she said you don't quit on them before you know for sure. Or it might have been the courthouse, or it might have been the creek. She stopped. It doesn't matter when. What matters is that it happened. She made herself hold his gaze. This was harder than the courthouse had been, which was not what she expected. But then again, the courthouse had been about Silver Briar, and this was about something that had no deed attached to it. I am not telling you this because I need something from you, she said. The ranch is mine. The legal claim is settled. Juniper has her room and her school and her maps and her place at this table. None of that requires you to feel anything in particular about me. She paused. But I am telling you this because you told me, in that courtroom, that you loved me too much to spend the rest of your life wondering. And I think you deserve to know that you don't have to wonder about me. She stopped. She had said it. She waited. Bram set his coffee cup down on the side table. He did it carefully, the way he did everything, and then he folded his hands in his lap and looked at her with the expression she had never been able to read fully, the one with edges, the one that moved underneath whatever he showed on the surface. Evelyn, he said. Yes, I packed my saddlebag last night. She went very still. Not because I wanted to leave, he said, before she could speak. Because I was trying to figure out whether I should. Whether staying was whether I had any right to stay, now that there was no arrangement left to hold me here. He looked at his hands. I've been in that room 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Looking at the bag. Not packing it, just looking at it. She understood what that meant the 3 times. The looking without packing. A man who had spent years staying light, because staying light meant losing less, trying to figure out whether the old habit still applied. I told myself, he said, that I would wait, that I would see if you said anything. And if you didn't, I would leave cleanly, before it got to the point where leaving was the kind of thing that left a mark. And if I did say something, he looked up at her. I've been hoping you would, he said, for about 6 weeks. Something released in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight. 6 weeks, she said. Approximately, you could have said something. You're the one who came to me with a proposal last time, he said, and there was the corner of the mouth thing, the almost smile, more present now than it had been in the first weeks. I figured the pattern held. She laughed, which surprised her. It came out genuine and a little undignified, which was unusual for her, and which she decided was acceptable. He smiled then, really smiled, not the controlled near version, and it changed his face in a way that made her understand. She had not fully seen him until this moment, or not seen this part, the part that wasn't braced against anything. So he said, what are you proposing? She had thought about this too. She had thought about the original document, the marriage certificate, the legal record, the thing that had started all of this, and she had thought about what it meant versus what she wanted it to mean. And she had come to a decision about that. I'm proposing, she said, That we tear up the original agreement. He waited. Not the marriage, the arrangement. The document in my desk drawer that outlines what you owe me and what I owe you, and what happens when the legal claim is settled. She paused. I want to burn it. And I want to start over. Not in a courthouse because a clause requires it. Not as a transaction between a woman who needed something and a man who had something to offer. She looked at him. Just as two people who have been living in the same house and raising a child together and working a ranch together, and who have, between them, enough complications and imperfections and history to keep things genuinely interesting for a considerable length of time. He was quiet for a moment. That's your proposal, he said. That's my proposal. He picked up his coffee cup. He drank from it, set it down again, and looked at the fire. I'm not an easy man, he said. I know that. I don't talk about things I should talk about. I make decisions without consulting people I should consult. I carry things, he paused, the weight of what my father lost. The years of Juniper growing up in bunkhouses. I've been angry about those things for a long time, and I'm not always aware of when the anger is there. I know that too. He looked at her. And you're not, he stopped. Started again. You are one of the most capable people I have ever encountered, and that is not always easy to live beside. You make decisions fast. You are right most of the time, which would be easier to be around if you were wrong more often. I know, she said dryly. I'm not sure I can match you, he said, in the ways that you might eventually want to be matched. Bram, she leaned forward slightly. I spent 11 years looking for men who could match me, and finding men who wanted to replace me. I am not looking to be matched. I am looking for someone who works beside me without needing to be above me. Someone who tells me when the fence posts are the wrong gauge and walks into a flooding creek and puts a latch on a door. She paused. Someone whose daughter has started leaving books on my desk after she finishes them. He looked at her sharply. She's been doing that? For 3 weeks. He absorbed this. Something moved across his face, the same simple, uncomplicated thing she had seen when he looked at Juniper the night of the pies. She didn't tell me, he said. She didn't want to push, Evelyn said. She's learning that from somewhere. He sat with that for a moment, and she let him. Then he said, all right, she said. He stood up. She stood up. They were on opposite sides of the fire, which felt like a distance that had become unnecessary, and she crossed it. She put her hand on his arm, and he put his hand over hers, and that was all no declaration, no gesture too large for the room. Just the acknowledgement of something that had been building for months finally arriving where it was going. The saddlebag, she said. I'll unpack it in the morning. Tonight, she said. He looked at her. Tonight, she said again. I'd like to know it's done. They went upstairs together, and he unpacked its shirts, tools, the few personal items that a man carries who has learned to carry little. She handed him the shelf, the real one in the larger room that she had offered him in the first week, and he looked at it with the expression of a man trying to understand what he was being given. It's a shelf, she said. I know what it is. Then put your things on it. He did. Juniper found out the next morning, before anyone told her anything, because she was perceptive enough to read a household the way her father read weather, and because the saddlebag was on the shelf in the wrong room, and her father was at breakfast, with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who had put something down, after a long time of carrying it. She sat down at the table and looked at both of them, and said nothing for a full minute, in the manner of someone running calculations. Then she said to Evelyn, are you going to stay our family? The question was direct in the way that children are direct when they have been patient about something for as long as they can manage. Yes, Evelyn said. Juniper looked at her father. Yes, he said. She nodded once, with the gravity of someone receiving information she had been preparing for and was glad to finally have confirmed. Then she helped herself to another piece of bread and asked Bram whether they were going to try Black Banner under a saddle this week, because she had been thinking about the approach and had some ideas. Bram looked at his daughter for a moment. Let's hear them, he said. Spring came to Silver Briar the way it always did in Montana, tentatively at first, pulling back twice for every step forward, the ground still hard in the mornings and the creek running high with snowmelt, and then all at once. A week in March where the temperature turned and the grass showed green under the dead cover, and the horses came alive in the pastures with the particular energy of animals who had been waiting. Black Banner carried a rider for the first time in April. It was Bram, which was right. He had done the work. He had earned the trust, And when the stallion moved under him, for the first time in the east pasture, it was not a victory so much as a conclusion, the last step in a conversation that had been going on for months. The horse moved with the power and the precision that his bloodlines had always promised, and Evelyn stood at the fence with Juniper and watched and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. After, Bram brought the horse to the fence and looked at Evelyn. "Your turn," he said. She had not expected that. "He's ready," Bram said. "He's been ready for you for 2 months. I've been waiting for you to ask." She looked at the horse. Black Banner looked back at her with the alert, interested attention of an animal that had learned the difference between people it trusted and people it didn't, and had made its determination about her some time ago. She went through the gate. She did not ride him perfectly. She was not Bram, and she did not have his specific fluency with the stallion's particular language. He felt her uncertainty twice, and she felt him feel it, and she adjusted, and he adjusted back, and they worked it out the way you work out most things between two individuals who are both trying imperfectly, honestly, with a genuine willingness to keep going. When she came back to the fence, Juniper was grinning in the way she grinned when she was trying not to. "You pulled left," the girl said. "I know," he noticed. "He told me." "What did you do?" "I stopped pulling left." Juniper considered this. "Is that what you do when you do something wrong? Just stop doing it?" Evelyn looked at the girl 9 years old, with her father's dark hair and her mother's name and the Silver Briar mud on her boots and a book-shaped lump in her coat pocket and the particular brightness of a child who had finally stopped waiting to be sent away. "Usually," Evelyn said. "The hard part is admitting you were doing it." Juniper absorbed this and filed it, as she filed everything, for later use. The valley adjusted to the new reality of Silver Briar, the way valleys always adjust to things they initially resist slowly, and then all at once, and then as if it had always been obvious. Gideon Voss remained cordial and distant, which was a workable arrangement. The ranch wives who had sent concerned notes sent appreciative ones when the Becker water situation was resolved and the upstream work that had caused it was publicly attributed. The hands who had once questioned Bram's right to be at Silver Briar now simply worked beside him, which was a more meaningful form of acceptance. Cutter, who had not needed to adjust his opinion because his opinion had been accurate from the beginning, remained Cutter. Jonas Harlan's maps were copied 3 times, on better paper, by a cartographer in town who understood their significance, and 1 copy was filed with the county land office. 1 copy was kept in Evelyn's desk, and the 3rd was given to Juniper, who kept it folded inside the front cover of the book she was currently reading, because she went where the maps went, and the maps went where she went. Thaddeus Crowell settled the Becker civil suit the following autumn. The terms were not made public, but they were, by several accounts, unfavorable. He left the territory the following spring and did not return, which was the closest thing to a clean ending that these situations ever produced. What Evelyn understood by the time the first real summer settled over Silver Briar warm evenings, the grass tall in the upper meadow, the horse herd moving through the south pasture in the long light, was that the story people told about her in the valley was not quite the true one, and that this was probably always going to be the case. They said she had married a poor cowboy to save her ranch. This was true. They said the poor cowboy had turned out to have hidden value, which was the valley's way of making the story make sense by their own accounting he had. The maps, the knowledge, the bloodlines through his father's operation, all of which had appreciated Silver Briar's worth. This was also true, but it was not the point. The point, which Evelyn understood on an evening in June, when she was standing at the corral fence, watching Juniper work Black Banner through a light ground exercise, while Bram called corrections from the fence with the patience of a man who believed entirely. In the person he was teaching, the point was that none of the things that mattered most about Bram Harlan had been hidden value. They had been obvious from the beginning. He had told her in the first conversation they ever had that his daughter would enter Silver Briar as family or not at all. He had shown her, in the first weeks, that he was a man who fixed things he could see that needed fixing, regardless of whether the fixing was his assignment. He had demonstrated, through months of daily small choices, that he was someone whose inside and outside were the same thing, not because he was exceptional, but because he had been consistent, and consistency over time was its own form of integrity. She had seen all of it. She had simply needed the fear to leave before she could look at it clearly. That was the thing nobody told you about survival, how much of your vision it consumed. How you could be in a room with something worth keeping and not fully see it because you were so occupied with watching the doors. She had been watching the doors for 11 years. She was not watching them anymore. Juniper brought the horse to a stop near the fence and looked at her father for the assessment. Better, Bram said. You're not fighting him when he drifts right. You're redirecting. It's the same thing, Juniper said. It's not. Fighting says you're wrong. Redirecting says, let's try this instead. He leaned on the rail. He responds better to the second one. Juniper thought about this from the back of the horse. Most things do, she said. Bram looked at her. Then he looked at Evelyn, who was leaning on the fence beside him. She looked back at him, and there was the corner of his mouth, and she had stopped trying to prevent herself from finding it as remarkable as she did. Most things do, she agreed. The evening settled over Silver Briar the way evenings settled there, wide and unhurried, the mountains catching the last light while the valley below moved into shadow. The horses came to the fence in the slow drift of animals at the end of a day, and the stable hands moved through their evening rounds. And somewhere inside the house, May was doing whatever May did that kept the household running in ways that Evelyn had learned not to examine too closely. 6,000 acres. A black stallion who had decided, of his own considered judgment, to trust the people who had waited long enough for him to make that decision. A girl with maps in her coat pocket and mud on her boots, and a room with a latch on the door that she no longer needed to use but was glad to have. A man who had unpacked a saddlebag on a Tuesday night and put his things on a shelf, which was the smallest and most complete way she knew to describe what it looked like when a person finally stopped leaving. And Evelyn Ashbourne, who had married for a deed and stayed for something that had no legal description and required no court to confirm who had learned, at 36, standing at a fence in the last light of a Montana evening, that the things most worth keeping were rarely the things you had started out trying to protect. The ranch was hers. It had always been hers. What she had not known when she rode to Kellerman's that afternoon 11 months ago to make a practical arrangement with a practical man was that practical arrangements made between people who are paying attention have a way of becoming something else entirely. Something that doesn't have a clause. Something that holds.